Thank you, Adam, and thank you, worship team. Tremendous. Taking our attention from the class we were just in and bringing it to the Lord. Well, I haven't been with you for a number of weeks now, but we started with some series pivoting around good, and it really isn't related to the Sermon on the Mount, but it in many ways parallels some of the themes that we're exploring. But we talked about a good start, having a good start here at Briercrest. We talked about having a good purpose, a good education. And this morning I want to talk about being a good neighbor. And I want to broaden that context a little bit for us this morning. But we've always enjoyed connecting with our neighbors. Where we live now in Moose Jaw, we have young families on both sides of us. I think they kind of look at us as the grandparents on the street. I'm not sure if that's a good thing, but we enjoy our neighbors. And wherever we've lived, we've worked hard at connecting with our neighbors, having them in our home in time, at the right time, inviting them to church or to opportunities to somehow be exposed to the wider Christian community or the gospel. And at times we even saw some people cross the line of faith and embrace Jesus and follow Jesus. And those things were so rewarding. Where we lived in Ontario, it was Pleasantville. I mean, we'd have block events, and we'd have water balloon fights on the street, and we'd watch over each other's kids on the sidewalk. We'd watch out for each other's homes when we were on vacation. It was just a very pleasant community spirit that we enjoyed on our street. But we had one neighbor that would often make things difficult. I've told you a little bit about our neighbor, Bob, before. But there are times when something would flare up, and on one occasion, our neighbor had conflict with another neighbor on the other side over, if you can believe this, wind chimes. Because these wind chimes were too loud at night. And so in the morning, their neighbor's wind chimes were in the ground, and then he'd lift them up, and then they're in the ground, and then he'd lift them up, and then in the ground. And this kept going on and on and on, and Pleasantville became like World War II's Russian front. I mean, it was just, the conflict was palpable. On another occasion, there were 3 cruisers, police cruisers in front of his house, and they were escorting out our neighbor in handcuffs, and they were carrying a rifle. And I'm thinking, okay, I want to love my neighbor, but I kind of like to live beside my neighbor. So, you see this kind of thing in your neighborhood, and it's a little bit alarming, and yet we want to be good neighbors. This passage, Jesus helps us understand what it means to be a good neighbor, and he helps us understand what exactly that is, and what are the implications that has for a follower of Christ. So here in the passage that Adam read, just giving you the context, Jesus just sent out 72, his 12, and then others, and he's given them some field assignments. And they've come back and they've been debriefing on what they've learned in this experience. And while they're debriefing, while they're talking about all this, they're visited by somebody who likely has been tracking with Jesus, or certainly is aware of Jesus' moves and his message. And we're told that this expert of the law came to Jesus with a question. This expert of the law, this lawyer was, well, I guess you could say he was one part seminary professor, one part ordained pastor, one part attorney, and one part snake in the grass, because he was trying to set up Jesus. He wasn't that interested in learning from Jesus, but he was interested in somehow entrapping Jesus and incriminating Jesus by his own words. So he comes to Jesus and he says, how can I get this thing that you call eternal life? And so he engages Jesus here in this passage, and we're told it's a trap, so we know that he's not particularly interested in listening to what Jesus has to say, but here, Jesus uses this opportunity to send a profound message to both him and to all who are listening in this occasion. And so he asks this expert in the law, well, what does the law say? And this expert of the law very appropriately quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. And then to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, we're going to talk about the rest of the story, but I've got to pause here just for a moment. The rest of this episode talks about the second part of that commandment, loving your neighbor. The very next story in Luke's account is the story where Jesus is engaging Mary and Martha, and they're planning a dinner party. And Martha's all caught up in the preparations while Mary is simply enjoying the presence of Jesus. In large measure, Luke there is answering the first question of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, as Mary was engaged in. Well, back to the story. Jesus asks, what does the law say? And this man quotes from Deuteronomy 6. And Jesus says, right answer. If you actually live this out, you will live. Now, a little bit of speculation, but I likely expect that the right answer from the man at this time would have been, the expert in law, would have been, but I can't do that. I can't do that perfectly. I struggle living that out. Instead, what does he say? Verse 29, but he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? You see, he knew that he didn't love all people. Who does? And yet he did love some people. Who doesn't? So he throws us back at Jesus, again, trying to set Jesus up. And Jesus here uses this as an opportunity to communicate with great clarity the essence of the gospel and how we show love one to another. And he tells a story about the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. A very dangerous 27 kilometers. And along this road were all kinds of caves and crevices, tremendous opportunities for thieves to hide in and then pounce on unsuspecting travelers along this road. 5th century Jerome called this road the Red Way or the Bloody Way. This was a terribly dangerous path, and here we have a story of a reckless or naive traveler. And in this story, there's an assault, there's a robbery, but then there's a rescue. So here, this traveler, this naive, innocent, or reckless traveler is taken advantage of. He's robbed, he's beaten, and he's left for dead. And a priest comes along. Someone who you would expect to have a heart for this person in this situation. But he created some distance and walked right on by. Perhaps he was aware of the teaching of the law, which says, well, don't touch dead bodies. It's not right to touch. So maybe he thought, the guy's dead anywhere, almost there. So, and he just completely disengages from this opportunity to serve this man. Second person comes along, a Levite, also a religious individual, also a person representing the religious establishment, representing his faith community, and he too walks by. Now you need to know both these individuals would have been employed. Neither were rich, or no reason to think that they were rich, but they certainly wouldn't have been poor. They would have had some means to help in some kind of way, but instead they disengaged, they turned a blind eye, and they walked right on by. So then Jesus says, in contrast to these two individuals who made themselves look bad and who made their faith look bad, this Jewish priest and this Jewish Levite, along comes a Samaritan, half Jew, half Gentile, somebody who was ethnically diluted in a time when ethnicity mattered greatly. Racism was alive and well 2,000 years ago, as it is today. Here, this Samaritan who was certainly considered outside of the orbit of acceptable friendships and relationships, he didn't dot his theological I's correctly. He would have been seen as a liberal. He would have probably spent his days at Starbucks reading poetry. I mean, he was just so disengaged, you would think, no nobility, no strength of character in him, they would have thought. But what do we read? What do we see here? But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He sees and he feels. And he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on him. And then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day, he took 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him. And whatever more you spend, I will repay when I come back." So here, the Samaritan, completely surprised in this plot that was developing, completely unexpected response. He is the one who ends up demonstrating nobility and integrity and compassion and care. He sees, he feels, and he acts. He is the one who sees the need and answers the need. And so Jesus asks. He asks this expert of the law, this seminary professor, ordained minister, attorney, and he says, so you tell me, who gets the neighbor concept? He wasn't speechless. He says, I guess the Samaritan. Because you see, the message that Jesus is driving home for this expert of the law and for everybody in his hearing and for you and I today in 2018 is that a neighbor is anyone who has a need that you might be able to meet. Anybody who has a need, regardless of their ethnicity or race, regardless of past or present relationship, regardless of homogeneous connections, regardless of spiritual, theological, or moral standing, regardless of their ability to pay back, regardless of the risk or the cost, regardless of whether you like them or not. We think of neighbors as someone in proximity, somebody with whom we share life. We may or may not know them, but Jesus redefines this. He says a neighbor is anybody who has a need. And there in that need, you might be able to meet that need in some kind of fashion or in some kind of way. That's the message. So let's talk a little bit about application. I'm so exercised and so concerned that we live out the scriptures. In our environment here, we get so much good education. And it's difficult to catch up with application. But I want to talk a little bit about application here because this will be a life principle for you. Here, a good neighbor first sees. So what do you see? What do you observe? First of all, some people just don't see. They're so inattentive and so unobservant. Others see, and then they complain, and they gripe, and they bemoan, and they criticize. You know, it's the government's fault. It's the church's fault. It's the parents' fault. It's Hollywood's fault. It's the doctor's fault. Or it's like this, it's the system's fault. And it's, we see and we just complain and criticize. And some people see only with a view to complaining and criticizing, but not engagement. Not with the attitude, perspective, or orientation to do anything about it. But good neighbors see needs. And they ask themselves, is this something I could actually contribute to? Could I be on the solution side of this problem? And so here, we see that good neighbors see, they feel, and they act. They're activists. They're action-oriented. They wonder, maybe I'm the one who can do something about this. So what do you see in your world? We just talked about Joe's place. Do you see the youth at risk in Moose Jaw? It's real. Do you see our indigenous communities across our province and across really our entire nation with lack and limitations in health care and education, employment opportunities, certainly the need for the gospel? Do you see refugees trying to make a new world for themselves? Extract yourself from the political controversies related to just do you see the needs of people who are disconnected and alienated and without hope, trying to rebuild their world? Or perhaps we need to think a little bit broader. What do you see when you look at the news and you read about these ongoing, relentless, horrendous, volatile, hostile conflicts in the Middle East or in portions of Africa? The conflict just peppers those regions and has for centuries. Or do you see what's going on in war-torn Yemen? There is right now brewing perhaps what may become the most lethal famine in 100 years. 14 million people are at risk in this famine. That is almost half the population of Canada. Or when you think of the 1040 window, or if you think of the billions of Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and Asians and Europeans who need Christ, somebody should do something, right? Somebody's not engaging. And when you see that, what does that stir inside of you? Because you see here, a neighbor is anyone who has a need. A need that you might be able to do something about. So, it's October 31st here. You are neck deep in exams and midterms and papers, and it is hard to envision that there's a future. There is a future. But our prayer for you is, while we are deeply committed to giving you the best possible education we can give you, our prayer is that God stirs within you some sense of call, that you will develop the heart of Jesus and the heart of a good neighbor, such that you will see a need somewhere and you'll think, I could do something about that. Not sure what, but I'm so exercised, I'm so disturbed in my spirit, I'm so angry about this problem, this blight, this issue, and yet I'm so brokenhearted over it. Maybe I could do something about that. And I pray in your time here, however short or long, I pray that you carve out some time to reflect upon what God might be doing in you as it relates to a sense of direction and call. Because he wants you to be a good neighbor. He wants you to have eyes to see needs and to ask yourself the question, could I meet that need? Could I be that someone who is the solution to that problem? Whether it's to fix a problem, solve a puzzle, stack a chair, bring hope, resolve a conflict, whatever it might be. That is our prayer for you. Now, how is that going to become a reality? Let me push even more fundamentally here. Seeing needs is a virtue, but it's also a skill, and it's a habit. And so I want to encourage you, and I want to empower you, and I want to remind you afresh that to be a good neighbor has nothing to do with owning a home and being the grandparents to the people beside you. Being a good neighbor is having the perception of needs around you and then somehow entering those needs. Listen, this room right now is full of needs. So there's a first-year student who's processing all this, and you could come alongside them. There's someone else over here who's got anxiety, and how might you be able to step into that and be a support and encouragement? Someone else over here has relational bumps, or somebody over here is gripped by some sort of issue, some sort of vice, some sort of compulsion, some sort of addiction. And someone over here is listless, needing some motivation. Don't be the priest who walks by. Don't be the Levite who walks by. This is an opportunity for you to live out the gospel in another person's life in that setting and situation, whoever they may be. And maybe it's a classmate, maybe it's a staff person, maybe it's a faculty person, maybe it's somebody in our community, maybe it's somebody you're engaging with in town. But these are opportunities for you to live out your faith. Robert Quinn, in his book, Building the Bridge as You Walk Across It, talks about this as the fundamental state of leadership. And what he's getting at is simply this. Saves you buying the book. You're always on. You're always on. You're always looking, always observant, always in yellow zone. You're always prepared. You're always scanning. You're always looking for an opportunity to somehow serve. Doesn't mean we never rest, but it just means you're aware that you are a Christian 24/7. That you're a follower of Christ, and when you see needs, maybe you're the one to meet that need instead of griping and complaining about somebody else doing it. And so when we talk about our vision of inspiring you to become leaders who will equip the church and engage the world, I fully get that some of you will never lead an organization. Many of you will. But some of you won't. Some of you may never have a title of manager or leader. But when you see a need and you meet a need, you are influencing that person. And you are leading them in paths of righteousness. And that's putting flesh to the gospel. So what's a good neighbor? A neighbor is anyone who sees a need that they might be able to do something about it. They see, they feel, and they act. Live in that fundamental state of leadership. Father in heaven, I want to pray for every person in this room, for every student, every staff person, every faculty person. Would you help us to walk through the halls of life engaged, perceptive, aware, observant? And would you stir within our hearts a spirit of compassion as you did with the Samaritan in this tale? Such that when we see someone in the weeds, that we determine that we'll do something. Maybe it'll be small. Maybe it'll be short term. Or maybe it'll be profound, significant, and long term. But help us not just to walk on by. Help us to engage. This is what you do. And this is what you want us to do. And so be good neighbors to the human family. So grant us that we become good neighbors in our communities, good neighbors in our places of employment, good citizens wherever you place us, all for the advancement of the reputation and call and cause of the Lord Jesus Christ. This we pray in his name.